The Spurs could eventually be forced to trade Devin Vassell. Not today, and probably not next summer, but Oklahoma City just gave San Antonio a warning about what can happen when a championship roster becomes expensive faster than the front office can adjust. The Thunder moved Lou Dort to Atlanta rather than carry his salary deeper into second apron territory. Vassell still has nearly $79 million in base salary left on his deal. Victor Wembanyama's extension begins in 2027-28, and Stephon Castle and Dylan Harper are moving toward much more expensive contracts of their own. The real question is not whether San Antonio needs to trade Vassell now. It is whether the Spurs can reach the summer of 2028 without being forced to choose which part of this core they can no longer afford.
Before getting buried in cap numbers, look at what Oklahoma City actually did. Dort was not a failed player. He was part of the Thunder's identity, took brutal defensive assignments, and started for a championship-level team. But his place in the offensive hierarchy kept shrinking as younger talent developed around him. He averaged 17.2 points in 2021-22 and only 8.3 last season. Eventually, Oklahoma City decided that keeping the same player at the same salary created more financial pressure than his smaller role justified. So Dort was moved for draft capital. That is what should make Spurs fans pay attention. Good teams do not always trade bad players. Sometimes they trade good ones because everyone else became too expensive.
Now, the salary math matters. San Antonio is not at the second apron cliff today. Depending on the final roster, incentives, and smaller moves, the Spurs project to operate only a few $1 million below the luxury tax line in 2026-27. The tax threshold is about $204 million. The second apron sits much higher, around $221.7 million. Those are very different problems. Paying tax costs ownership money. Living around or above the second apron can restrict how the front office builds the roster. So the Spurs still have room to maneuver. The danger is not the current payroll. It is the direction of the payroll once the young core stops being cheap. That direction becomes much more serious in 2028. Wembanyama's extension begins 1 year earlier and pushes his salary from a rookie-scale deal to roughly 25% of the cap. Castle becomes extension eligible in 2027, meaning a new deal could begin in 2028-29. If he continues on his current path, that raise could be enormous. Then in the summer of 2028, Harper becomes extension eligible too, with his own raise potentially arriving in 2029-30. At the same time, Vassell would be entering the final year of his contract at roughly $27 million. That is the pressure point. San Antonio could be paying Wembanyama, Fox, and Castle major salaries, while already negotiating the next expensive contract for Harper. And this is where the second apron becomes more than a tax story. A team that lives above it cannot simply spend more and keep operating normally. Trade flexibility becomes restricted, combining salaries becomes harder, certain roster-building tools disappear. Eventually, the team can become trapped with the expensive version of the roster it already has. That is dangerous for a contender, because championship teams still need to respond to injuries, bad matchups, and aging veterans. San Antonio spent years collecting flexibility. The franchise should be willing to pay for a contender, but paying is different from willingly locking itself into a roster it can no longer repair. That is why Vassell enters the conversation. His scoring has already changed with the team around him. He averaged 19.5 points in 2023-24 when San Antonio needed difficult shot creation from him. Last season, that fell to 13.9. On the surface, that looks like declining production, but that may be the wrong interpretation. Wembanyama now controls more of the offense. Fox organizes possessions, Castle and Harper need touches. Vassell is being asked to do less with the ball because the Spurs have better options than they did 2 years ago. The question is whether that smaller role makes him less valuable or allows him to become exactly the kind of wing a championship roster needs. That distinction is important because Vassell is not simply San Antonio's version of Dort. Dort gave Oklahoma City elite point-of-attack defense and a very specific role. Vassell gives the Spurs shooting gravity, movement scoring, and secondary creation. The players are different. The comparison is financial, not stylistic. Both reached a point where younger teammates were moving ahead of them in the offensive hierarchy, while their contracts remained significant. That creates the same test. Is this player important enough to protect as part of the expensive core? Or has he become a supporting piece whose production can eventually be replaced for less? If you appreciate Spurs analysis that looks beyond the next transaction, like the video and subscribe. Because this is where the Vassell conversation becomes more complicated. Trading him could help the cap sheet, but it could also remove one of the exact player types San Antonio may struggle to replace when Wembanyama, Castle, and Harper are carrying the offense. Saving money only helps if the basketball still works afterward. Championship teams need wings who can matter without controlling the ball. Wembanyama, Castle, and Harper can create advantages, but somebody still has to punish the defense after those advantages appear. Vassell can space beyond the arc, relocate when defenders turn toward Victor, and attack a closeout without needing an isolation called for him. If his lower scoring average is the result of moving from overextended creator to efficient connector, then the decline in points is not necessarily decline at all. It could be specialization. And if that version of Vassell also holds up defensively in May and June, a salary around $27 million may still make sense as the cap rises. But that is the loop San Antonio has to close over the next 2 seasons. Vassell cannot be protected because of what he averaged 3 years ago. The Spurs have to judge the possessions that decide playoff series. Can he defend a high-level scoring wing without requiring constant help? Can he survive when opponents hunt matchups? Can he hit the open three when 2 defenders lean toward Wembanyama? And when the first action fails, can he still create a reliable shot without needing the offense built around him? If the answer is yes, scoring less may actually make Vassell more valuable. If the answer is no, the financial argument becomes much harder to ignore. So, what are San Antonio's escape routes? There are really 3. The first is to cut around the edges. Keldon Johnson's expiring money can create relief. Tobias Harris is not a permanent commitment. Julian Champagna can be moved, and a younger wing like Carter Bryant could eventually absorb minutes on a rookie deal. That can preserve the stars and delay the hardest decision. But there is a limit. If the Spurs keep removing several useful contracts just to protect one larger one, they may save Vassell while quietly destroying the depth around Wembanyama. At some point, trimming the edges becomes more expensive on the court than removing one major salary. The second route is moving a bigger contract. Vassell is the obvious candidate because his deal is large enough to matter without completely rewriting the identity of the team. But he is not the only expensive player on the roster. De'Aaron Fox occupies far more cap space, and San Antonio already has Castle and Harper developing as on-ball creators. That does not mean the Spurs are preparing to trade Fox, and fan speculation is not evidence of a front office plan. It simply means the future choice may eventually become larger than Vassell versus the apron. If Castle and Harper become stars, San Antonio will have to decide which expensive skills are hardest to replace. And that is exactly why Fox and Vassell cannot be treated as interchangeable financial solutions. Moving Fox would change who organizes the offense and closes games beside Wembanyama. Moving Vassell would remove a wing skill set that could become even more valuable as the young guards take over more creation. One contract saves more money. The other may be easier to replace. That is the real cost of the second route. Solving the cap problem by creating a basketball problem. The Spurs should not ask which salary is easiest to move. They should ask which role would be hardest to recreate after the trade. The third route is simply paying. A franchise built around a generational player should not pretend contention must stay inexpensive forever.
If the Spurs are winning championships, ownership should be willing to pay luxury tax. But paying tax and living above the second apron for years are not the same decision. Wembanyama already gave San Antonio additional flexibility by taking the 25% max rather than the larger structure he potentially could have commanded. That helps. It does not make every future contract affordable. The Spurs may be able to pay almost everyone for a season. The harder question is whether they can preserve enough flexibility to fix the roster afterward.
That is why a Vassell trade now would be premature. San Antonio has something more valuable than immediate cap relief. Information it has not collected yet. The Spurs can spend the next season learning whether Vassell's reduced offensive role makes him more efficient or simply less influential. They can see whether his defense holds up through another postseason. They can watch how much creation Castle and Harper really need, and whether Carter Bryant develops fast enough to replace some of Vassell's minutes. Trading him today would solve a 2028 problem, before San Antonio knows whether losing him creates an even bigger one. But waiting forever carries its own risk. If the Spurs reach the final year of Vassell's contract with Castle already on a major extension and Harper negotiating his next deal, every team in the league will understand San Antonio's financial pressure. That can reduce leverage. The best timeline is therefore built around decision points, not panic. Next season, determine whether Vassell belongs in San Antonio's most trusted closing lineup. By the 2027 offseason, compare his playoff impact with the progress of the cheaper wings behind him. Then, before Castle's new money hits and Harper becomes extension eligible in the summer of 2028, decide whether Vassell belongs inside the expensive version of this core. That timeline also gives us the answer to the scoring question. If Vassell stays around 14 points per game, but shoots efficiently, defends important matchups, and consistently closes playoff games, the lower scoring average should not be treated as decline. It means his role changed because the Spurs became better. But if his touches shrink, his defense remains inconsistent, and cheaper players begin producing the same spacing and secondary creation, then his contract starts telling a different story. The point total is not the verdict. His value in the 5 possessions that decide a playoff game is. So there are ultimately 3 paths. San Antonio can keep Vassell and accept the financial cost of maintaining a deep contender. It can move him before the 2028 squeeze and convert his contract into draft capital, a younger forward, or a cheaper replacement. Or it can reshape another part of the roster, using smaller expirings first and eventually making an even larger decision if the guard hierarchy changes. None of those paths is painless. That is the strange reward for drafting and developing too much talent. The Spurs' problem is not that the roster has failed. The problem is that the roster may become too successful to remain inexpensive. So, will the second apron cost San Antonio Devin Vassell? Not automatically. Oklahoma City's decision on Lou Dort is a warning, not a prophecy. Vassell still has time to prove that his value can increase even while his scoring declines, that his shooting and defense remain essential when playoff possessions tighten, and that replacing him would hurt more than paying him. But if his role continues shrinking, if cheaper wings reproduce his impact, and if Castle and Harper become the stars San Antonio expects, his contract could become the cleanest way to protect the rest of the core. The Spurs do not need to trade Devin Vassell today. They need to spend the next 2 seasons finding out whether he is a core playoff wing or an expensive supporting piece before the finances make that choice for them. Because by the summer of 2028, San Antonio may no longer be deciding whether it wants to keep everybody. It may be deciding which good player it can afford to lose.